This is Back 4 Blood, the newest co-op zombie shooter, of course by Turtle Rock Studios. I grabbed it on Game Pass myself to check it out, played some matches with my fiance, and I'm here to report on what I think about it. Just as a quick sort of too long didn't watch, just for people at the very beginning of the video, is this a good game? Well, yeah, it's actually not too bad, although it does have some flaws, a lot of flaws actually, and some kind of baffling design decisions here and there, but I wouldn't say that any of those make it an objectively bad game. It's really not too bad. But is this Left 4 Dead 3? No, it's not. It most definitely is not Left 4 Dead 3. Its flaws keep it from greatness, really, but we'll get on to those in a little while. First off, what exactly is Back 4 Blood? Well, it uses a very, very familiar formula, probably to most of you, where you will be exploring around linear but relatively sizable maps, each containing a specific objective for you to complete, fighting across zombie hordes to actually complete that objective, and then ending up in a safe room at the end, shutting the door and then moving on to the next map. If you've played Left 4 Dead, then this game's formula will be extremely familiar to you, as well as most of its mechanics and stuff, because it all works in a very similar way. But let's start with what's different from Left 4 Dead. What does this game do that's actually unique to it? Well, for one, the cleaners, as you're called, the survivors, there are actually 8 of them rather than 4, and each one has its own set of passive abilities that they give the team, making each character not just an appearance, but also a set of skills, effectively. Once you complete the 4th mission of the campaign, you will unlock the other 4 characters to play as, so you will have all 8 choices available to you from very early in the game. The zombies, or the ridden as they're called in this game, also have special infected style threats that you'll have to deal with. However, each of these threats also has a couple of different variants, so that adds a lot of variety to the overall hordes that you're going to face, because there are actually quite a lot of different varieties of special infected or special ridden and mutations as they're called to deal with. There's also a lot more weapon variety in this game. It definitely kind of focuses on the gunplay, you could say. There's a lot of weapons to choose from, and there are also various mod caches that you can find throughout the map that will give you the ability to modify your weapons, from adding different stocks or like muzzle brakes or foregrips or different ammo types, all sorts of things like that. Each of the weapons can be modified in 4 different slots to increase their effectiveness in some way. So there's actually quite a lot of variety in the weaponry this time around, and of course, yes, there are indeed melee weapons as well. You do, of course, have your other slots, like utility slots for carrying ammo bags and defibrillators, an offensive item slot for carrying things like grenades and pipe bombs and Molotov cocktails, and a defensive item slot for carrying stuff like razor wire, taser, and some other things of that nature. But perhaps one of the biggest changes from Left 4 Dead's formula, and probably one of the most controversial changes that this game uses, is the card system. And the way that it works is that every time you leave a safe house and start a new map, the game will draw what are called corruption cards, which are basically difficulty increasing modifiers that can be all sorts of different things, like making certain zombies faster, or armoring the weak points on special ridden, or making certain zombies emit this like fire damage over time. There are all sorts of them. And they can also be special objectives that you can optionally complete to get better rewards if you want to as well, so it's sort of like a self-imposed challenge kind of idea. After it draws these cards and shows you what you're going to be up against, you have the chance to draw your own cards. Each player has an up to 15 card deck that they can create themselves. You can create all sorts of decks and save them, but you can only choose one deck per run through to actually draw from. And interestingly enough, you actually draw the cards in the order that you put them in the deck, which is sort of strange. It doesn't shuffle them or anything, so you always know which cards are going to be in your hand. And then during each of these intermissions, you can choose one of those cards to play, and these cards can be all sorts of different things, from basic stuff like giving yourself more health or more stamina, to team affecting things like making the entire team's ammo pool larger, to some more exotic stuff like making your bullets able to penetrate targets and things like that, to even some other ones that I think are kind of cool actually, that are very, very powerful but have different drawbacks as well. So you could do something like massively increasing your bullet damage but causing your stamina to drain faster, so you can't sprint as much or you can't melee as much, or causing you to be able to carry way more ammo than usual but you can no longer aim down sights, for instance. And yes, this game does have aim down sights. And the idea is for you to create a sort of build as you go through it to make yourself more and more powerful, and of course play cards that will help you against the corruption cards that the game plays at you, although since you can't choose your deck, that point is kind of moot in my opinion, because you can't really react to what the game throws at you all the time if the cards that you would like are in a different deck. Once you choose for that run, you can't change it, so I'm not sure about that since there are only 15 cards in a deck. But anyway, this is basically a way to make yourself stronger and stronger as each run goes for a longer period of time. It's also the game's main form of progression. There are a couple of currencies in the game. For one, there's copper, which you can just pick up randomly just by finding it during the maps, and you can also gain copper for completing those optional side objectives that the corruption cards give you. They're always worth doing because copper is actually spent in run. In every safe room, there's a small store that you can buy things from, like new weapons, new attachments for your weapons, you can heal yourself, you can buy the various consumables and things like that. And so it's nice to have a good amount of copper to spend in this store between missions. Also, every player has their own store of copper, so you spending yours doesn't spend the whole other team's, which is nice. And then there's supply points. Supply points are things that you get for completing the actual maps themselves. And you use a menu called supply lines to spend these points to unlock new cards to put into your deck. There are lots of different supply lines, each with their own theme. So for instance, one called The Clinic will have like health and healing themed cards, that sort of idea. And you will spend these points to unlock more cards. As you unlock these cards, you can then add them to any of your decks, and as you eventually unlock all of the cards in a supply line, that line will disappear and be replaced with another one that you can unlock more of. So that means that at first you're unlocking relatively simple cards, but as you complete more and more of the supply lines, you'll be getting more exotic, more powerful cards to go, so you want to get as many supply points as possible to keep unlocking more cards to build a better deck. And also in the supply lines, by the way, are cosmetics for guns and for the survivors themselves. Overall, I think it's an interesting system, but I'm honestly not too convinced about it. I'm not sure how much I feel that they add to the game versus how much of a grind they are to unlock. It seems like most of the reason for them being there is to give you a grind to unlock stuff. The actual difference they give you in-game is noticeable, and especially on higher difficulties can be necessary, but because of the way the game is balanced, which we'll get onto in a minute, I'm not really sure how much of an effect they have versus what the game can decide to just throw at you all of a sudden. Overall, the game is mechanically pretty solid. The shooting actually feels pretty chunky and nice. The sound assets aren't too bad. The animations are pretty quality. And the zombies are, of course, fun to slay in large numbers. But, well, although the basics are okay, that's really just sort of the tip of the iceberg in this case, because the game also has a large number of flaws and some very strange design decisions that kind of just make me wonder why it's like that. For instance, I mentioned that there are variants of the Special Ridden that add some variety to the game, and they do. I appreciate the variety they add, but in practice, it's really not a good idea in my opinion, because Left 4 Dead has a very specific style, a very certain art style. The survivors are very easy to tell apart from the zombies, and each of the special zombies are very easy to tell apart from the rest. No matter how big the hordes get, every time a special infected shows up, you know exactly what it is and exactly what kind of threat that it represents just by its silhouette alone. The design language of that game is very clear in general and just very good. However, in this case, each of these Special Ridden's variants look almost identical to each other, which makes it very difficult to tell them apart. They already don't have the best silhouettes to tell them apart at a distance at times, but the fact that there are different variants that all look pretty much exactly the same but do entirely different things is a huge problem. For instance, the Tall Boy is a big, tall zombie with a huge right arm that smacks you around with it and does a lot of damage. The Crusher is a tall zombie with a huge right arm that grabs you with it and holds you up in the air, and you have to be rescued by some of your teammates. And the Bruiser is a tall zombie with a huge right arm that smacks you around with it. I honestly don't know what the difference between a Tall Boy and a Bruiser is. They seem to do exactly the same thing, but the point is, all three of those variants look exactly the same, and you don't know which one is which until it's too late, generally. The same problem goes with stuff like the Sploder, which is basically like a boomer, the Reeker, which is like a boomer that calls a horde on you, so like a boomer, and the Wretch, which leaves damaging pools of acid behind. All of them look exactly the same, and yet they're all very different threats. The Stinger, for instance, which can glue itself to walls and fire this projectile at you that causes you to be stuck in place and need to be meleeed by your teammates to be freed. And the Stalker, I think it's called, which actually goes into melee range and drags one of your characters back. It acts kind of like a smoker, basically, but melee. Those also look exactly the same, and yet they act entirely differently. This is just a consistent problem throughout the whole game. All of these zombies look the same and yet act totally differently, and that makes the design language of the zombies and the way that you're supposed to actually respond to them a lot more muddy and messy than something like Left 4 Dead, which is very clear. This can extend to the maps as well, although a lot of the maps, in my opinion, are actually pretty good. I enjoyed several of them. Some of them, it's really not clear what you're supposed to be doing or where you're supposed to be going. Left 4 Dead's maps use Valve's classic light to lead you around the place, and it's always pretty obvious where you need to go next. But in Back 4 Blood, it's not always clear where you need to go next, and sometimes it feels like you're sort of running around in circles before you actually leave the area, and you don't know why you did all of that. Like, for instance, one early mission where you have to go into a library and defend it for a while for some reason, but it turns out there are survivors that you have to rescue, and then once you rescue them, you go out, and where do you go? The big building with a safe place spray painted on it in like fluorescent yellow? No, you don't go there. You go down a very dimly lit alleyway to the side of it that doesn't even look like it leads anywhere. They definitely do not always have clear paths through the levels marked for you, and sometimes it can be a bit confusing as to what you're supposed to be doing. But honestly, my biggest problem with the game is the way that the sort of AI director zombie spawner kind of idea actually works, because it seems to be all over the place in terms of difficulty and what it decides to throw at you. For instance, some of the levels can be very inconsistent in difficulty, like the very last level of Act 1. You might think this is the big Act 1 finale, it's going to be some sort of giant horde battle with a boss or something. No, it took us like 3 minutes to beat it, and none of us were ever in any danger. It was honestly kind of boring, and it was over really quick, and we were just done and moved on to the next level. Whereas the level before it, the second to last level, was incredibly difficult and took us like 3 tries to beat because it involved a lot of narrow ledges and infinitely spawning hordes. The game is also much too fond of spawning its special ridden on you. They are constantly everywhere. It actually makes them a lot less special, because in something like Left 4 Dead, the special infected were a very specific type of threat, and every time they appeared, they got your attention immediately, and they marked themselves out from the rest of the horde as something that you needed to deal with right now, because they were very dangerous. But in Back 4 Blood, the special ridden spawn so frequently that they just sort of blend in with the rest of the horde, because you're constantly facing 4, 5, 6 of them every single battle. There are tons of them everywhere, and the game is, like I said, much too fond of just dropping huge numbers of them right on your head for no reason all of a sudden. I remember one specific instance when we were going through that previously mentioned very difficult level where we were nearing the end, and I got smacked by a bruiser and taken down, so I was looking at my fiancée to have her help me, but she was webbed by a stinger and was also fighting her own bruiser, so I looked backwards to the 2 AI bots that were following us, and each of them were also fighting their own bruiser. That's 4 bruisers and 1 stinger, all on one small ledge where there are also a whole bunch of infinitely spawning zombies. Why? Why does the game need to spawn that many special ridden all the time? Every single encounter has like half a dozen of them. Overall, this game kind of reminds me of the similar problem that happened with Outer Worlds, in that it was a relatively good game that was marred by the fact that its marketing was constantly reminding us that the developers once made a much better game than that, and this feels exactly the same. This really is not something that you want to compare to Left 4 Dead, because it's just not as fun, not as tightly designed, not as visually interesting as Left 4 Dead, and yet the marketing constantly wants to remind us, by the team that made Left 4 Dead. And it's like, please stop doing that, because this is not as good, and you're actually making it look worse by constantly comparing it like that. And also, am I not mistaken in saying that the Turtle Rock of today is not the team that made Left 4 Dead? Most of those guys are gone. It's the team that made Evolve. And then when you add all this up to the fact that right now you cannot get any solo unlocks at all, no solo progression whatsoever. If you're playing by yourself, you cannot get supply points to unlock new cards. You don't even unlock the 4 characters if you complete the 4th level like you normally do. You don't get achievements, which are actually important because they give you new cards as well. You just don't get anything in solo, and from what I've heard, they're looking into that, which makes me think that's not intended, so that's something at least. But overall, I'd say this is definitely a game that is not worth full price at all. If you have Game Pass, then this is actually a really good proposition to try out, because you might have some fun with it. And if you've got some other friends, especially because this game does have crossplay enabled, so Game Pass users can play with Steam users and Xbox users if you want to, so that's nice at least, then yeah, try it out on Game Pass if you've got it. But overall, I would say do not purchase this for its full price on Steam. It is not worth it, it is too flawed, and it has too many problems to be worth that much money in my opinion. So that's my look at Back 4 Blood, kind of as expected, you know, a bit disappointing, but not absolutely horrible or anything, just kind of meh. You know, if you've got some friends, it's probably gonna give you a little bit of entertainment, but only on Game Pass for the price that this game is currently asking for itself. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.